The sun rises over the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, casting long shadows across a land that seems quiet at first glance, yet hums with unseen activity. In the heart of this ancient landscape, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carve winding paths, Uruk emerges, not as a village or a settlement, but as the world's first city, a living organism of clay, labor, and human ambition. From above, the city is a tapestry of mud brick walls, narrow alleys, and bustling squares, a testimony to humanity's first conscious effort to create an organized, enduring society. Imagine standing at the gates of Uruk, feeling the heat of the sun on your skin as the aroma of fresh bread, baked clay, and livestock fills the air. The streets are alive. Merchants carry baskets of grain and dates. Artisans shape pottery on spinning wheels, and scribes inscribe the earliest written records onto soft clay tablets. The city vibrates with purpose. Every wall, every canal, every pathway is a deliberate attempt to manage human life at a scale never seen before. People are no longer scattered across the plains in small, ephemeral communities. They are concentrated, interconnected, and dependent upon one another. Thousands of miles away, in the Indus Valley, Mohenjo-Daro rises from the dust along the banks of the mighty Indus River. Its layout is precise, astonishingly so. Streets intersect at perfect right angles, forming a rigid grid, each block carefully planned to accommodate both homes and public spaces. Covered drains and public wells testify to a sophisticated understanding of sanitation, an attention to daily life that speaks to an advanced civic consciousness. Standardized bricks hint at a shared system of production, a collective approach to building that allowed thousands to live together safely and efficiently. Here, the city is a machine, designed for order and sustainability, yet also a stage where human ingenuity and culture play out in daily routines, markets, and ceremonies. In the valleys of the Yellow River in China, early settlements take shape under the guidance of rivers, floods, and fertile soil. Unlike the rigid grids of Mohenjo-Daro or the sprawling streets of Uruk, these cities grow organically, clustering around central courtyards and ceremonial spaces. Houses are built close together for warmth and security, yet the city maintains a sense of order, a reflection of the people's understanding of space, community, and environmental adaptation. Along these rivers, early urban planners learned to balance the needs of agriculture, defense, and daily life, creating settlements that can support larger populations over time. Across these regions, one pattern becomes clear. Cities are not mere aggregations of houses. They are expressions of human ambition, intellect, and cooperation. They require leadership, planning, and foresight. A single miscalculation, a poorly dug canal, a weak wall, a mismanaged grain store, could disrupt life for thousands. Cities are fragile, yet their very existence demonstrates humanity's ability to imagine, organize, and sustain complexity. They are laboratories where the future of civilization is being tested, with successes and failures shaping the trajectory of history. Walk through the streets of Uruk in the early morning. Traders from distant villages converge in marketplaces, exchanging not only goods but ideas, stories, and innovations. Artisans hammer, carve, and mold materials into tools, ornaments, and ritual objects. Laborers move bricks and sand, maintaining walls and public buildings. Priests perform ceremonies at towering temples, their chants echoing through courtyards and streets. Life is structured yet dynamic. The city itself pulses like a living organism, sustained by the energy and collaboration of its inhabitants. Meanwhile, Mohenjo-Daro's urban planners ensure that the flow of water, the placement of homes, and the routing of waste all function together seamlessly. Every aspect of daily life is considered. Children play along canals that double as drainage channels, women draw water from public wells, and men labor in workshops that produce goods for both local use and long-distance trade. The city reflects a sophisticated understanding of order, hygiene, and social organization, emphasizing collective well-being alongside individual activity. Early Chinese cities along the Yellow River illustrate yet another approach to urban life. Buildings cluster around ceremonial spaces and communal courtyards, creating neighborhoods that serve both residential and spiritual functions. Agricultural fields surround the settlements, and elevated earthworks or levees are constructed to protect against seasonal flooding. These urban centers blend adaptation to the environment with social cohesion, a balance of human need and natural constraint. Leadership emerges, often intertwined with religious or ritual authority, guiding construction, irrigation, and defense. Across all these cities, several unifying themes emerge. First, they reflect a shift from survival to creation, from scattered villages focused solely on sustenance to organized centers where humans can invest in culture, religion, governance, and innovation. Second, they demonstrate the power of cooperation, as large numbers of people must coordinate their labor, resources, and skills to sustain daily life. Third, they introduce hierarchies, as social stratification allows elites, artisans, laborers, and administrators to specialize and collaborate in increasingly sophisticated ways. Finally, they are laboratories for human ingenuity, testing new technologies, social structures, and cultural practices that will shape civilization for millennia. Yet urban life is also precarious. Uruk and Mohenjo-Daro, despite their sophistication, face environmental pressures, disease, social unrest, and threats from raiders. One failed harvest or flood can ripple through the city, destabilizing both economy and society. Leaders, planners, and priests must constantly adapt, making decisions that affect thousands of lives. The success of these cities depends not only on their structures and walls, but on the adaptability, intelligence, and cooperation of their inhabitants. In exploring these early cities, we also witness the birth of culture. Markets are not only places of exchange, they are spaces where ideas, traditions, and innovations circulate. Temples are not only sacred, they are centers of power, governance, and knowledge. Workshops are not only practical, they are laboratories of craft, art, and technological experimentation. Even streets themselves are cultural artifacts, designed to accommodate daily rituals, social interactions, and civic responsibilities. Across continents, despite differences in environment and approach, Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese cities converge on a single idea. A city is an organized system of people, structures, and resources that allows complex human life to flourish. They are experiments in permanence, cooperation, and innovation. They show us the potential and fragility of human society, the first attempts to create something larger than any single individual or family. As night falls, the streets quiet. Fires flicker in homes, the sound of markets fades, and canals reflect the moonlight. Yet the city does not sleep. It exists as an enduring monument to human ambition. It represents the moment when humanity transitioned from scattered survival to collective achievement, laying the foundation for writing, governance, and culture. These first cities, Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements, are the cradle of urban civilization. They reveal both the triumphs and vulnerabilities of humanity, illustrating our capacity for planning, cooperation, and creativity. They also hint at the next great innovation, the written word, a tool that will allow these urban centers to govern, preserve knowledge, and connect generations across time. This is the world we will inhabit in the coming hour. Streets, canals, homes, workshops, temples, and markets teeming with human life. From the careful planning of Mohenjo-Daro-esque grids to the bustling chaos of Uruk-esque markets and the adaptive organization of Chinese river settlements, we witness the first cities in all their complexity. Every stone laid, every canal dug, every ritual performed contributes to the story of urban civilization. And as we walk these ancient streets in our minds, we can feel the heartbeat of the first cities, a rhythm of labor, devotion, creativity, and ambition that echoes through history. These are the streets where civilization first awoke, where human life became organized on a scale that was both magnificent and fragile. They are the beginnings of a story that will unfold across continents and millennia, the story of humanity's first great leap into urban life. The story of the first cities begins not with walls or monuments, but with the earth itself. Agriculture, humanity's first deliberate attempt to control and cultivate nature, set in motion forces that would transform scattered villages into thriving urban centers. Where once people roamed as hunters and gatherers, following the rhythms of seasons and wildlife, they now tilled fields, tended herds, and harvested predictable crops. This shift from foraging to farming created not only food security but population growth, and with growing numbers of people came the necessity of organization, cooperation, and centralized space. In the Fertile Crescent, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates flooded predictably, enriching the soil and allowing multiple harvests each year. Early farmers could grow more than they consumed, producing surplus grain that could be stored, traded, or used to support specialized labor. Surplus production meant that not everyone needed to farm. Some could become artisans, priests, traders, or administrators. This economic diversification was the first step toward urban life. Populations grew because the land could feed more people reliably than it had for millennia. Villages expanded, some eventually merging to form towns, which in turn coalesced into cities. In the Indus Valley, along the banks of the mighty Indus River, similar patterns emerged. Farmers cultivated wheat, barley, and pulses, while also domesticating cattle, sheep, and goats. The predictability of food supply allowed larger communities to settle permanently, rather than moving seasonally in search of sustenance. As settlements grew, people faced new challenges: how to manage water for drinking and irrigation, how to coordinate labor, how to distribute goods equitably, and how to resolve disputes. These challenges were the seeds of urban planning and governance. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa are enduring evidence of how these early societies addressed such problems with ingenuity, creating grid-like streets, standardized bricks, and public wells. Meanwhile, in the Yellow River Basin of China, early agricultural settlements had to contend with seasonal flooding and shifting river courses. People responded by building levees, canals, and raised platforms for housing. Agricultural surplus allowed the development of workshops for pottery, metallurgy, and weaving. Families settled in tightly clustered compounds, and communal structures emerged to support social cohesion and shared ritual. Here again, we see the link between productive agriculture, population concentration, and the birth of urban structures. Agriculture also encouraged trade. Surplus food could be exchanged for tools, raw materials, or crafted goods from neighboring settlements. Over time, trade networks extended across regions, creating interdependent communities and encouraging the development of markets within urban centers. Cities were the natural nodes for this exchange. Uruk, for example, became a hub where goods from surrounding villages and distant regions converged, and where the economy could support specialized roles such as scribes, merchants, and skilled artisans. This specialization, in turn, reinforced the need for organized administration, creating the foundation for governance structures. Population growth further accelerated urbanization. As more people gathered in one place, villages needed more coordinated systems for water distribution, sanitation, and waste management. Urban density required careful planning. Streets had to be wide enough for carts and pedestrians, houses arranged efficiently, and public spaces allocated for markets, temples, and workshops. Cities were no longer just settlements. They were engineered environments, designed to sustain a growing number of inhabitants while facilitating trade, labor, and governance. The rise of cities also changed social dynamics. In small villages, everyone had roughly equal responsibilities, and leadership could be informal. In cities, the scale of interaction required hierarchies. Rulers, administrators, and priests emerged to coordinate labor, adjudicate disputes, and oversee public projects. Artisans and merchants occupied specialized roles, while farmers supplied the food necessary to sustain urban populations. Social stratification became more pronounced. Elites controlled resources and decision-making, while laborers performed essential but often physically demanding work. These early hierarchies allowed cities to function efficiently, yet they also introduced inequalities and power dynamics that would shape civilizations for millennia. Religious practice became another driver of urban organization. Temples and ceremonial centers were constructed not only as spiritual spaces, but as loci of social and political control. Priests often wielded authority, coordinating festivals, rationing surplus goods, and influencing decisions of rulers. Public rituals reinforced social cohesion, signaling shared beliefs and community identity. Architecture reflected these priorities. Ziggurats in Mesopotamia, large public baths in the Indus Valley, and ceremonial compounds in early Chinese settlements demonstrated how spiritual, social, and administrative needs were intertwined. Infrastructure innovation accompanied these changes. In Mohenjo-Daro, brick-lined drainage systems channeled wastewater safely away from homes. Public wells provided clean water to neighborhoods. Streets were systematically laid out to facilitate movement and access. In Uruk, monumental walls and gates protected the population, while also symbolizing civic pride and power. Early Chinese settlements leveraged levees and platforms to mitigate flooding, allowing permanent habitation in previously risky areas. These innovations show how human ingenuity responded to the pressures of concentrated population and urban life. Urbanization also accelerated cultural exchange. With more people interacting daily, knowledge, art, and technology spread quickly within the city. Markets became hubs not only for commerce but for ideas. Pottery styles, religious symbols, writing techniques, and metallurgical practices circulated widely. Cities created a feedback loop. Population density demanded organization, which required administration, which promoted literacy and record-keeping, which in turn supported trade and governance. Each innovation reinforced the others, creating a foundation for increasingly complex civilizations. Despite their achievements, early cities remained vulnerable. Environmental fluctuations, crop failures, and social unrest could quickly destabilize life. City planners had to anticipate flood cycles, water shortages, and potential conflicts. Walls and fortifications offered protection, but they could not eliminate all threats. The fragility of urban life underscores the ingenuity required to sustain these communities and the delicate balance between human ambition and environmental reality. Ultimately, urbanization was humanity's first experiment in collective life at scale. It was driven by agriculture, facilitated by population growth, and sustained through labor specialization, trade, governance, and shared ritual. Cities like Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements were the product of thousands of individual decisions. Families settling near fertile land, artisans refining their craft, leaders organizing labor, priests maintaining spiritual cohesion. The rise of cities was a story not only of architecture and planning, but of people learning to live together, to cooperate, and to create systems that could endure across generations. By the end of this introduction, it becomes clear that urbanization was not an accidental development. It was the inevitable consequence of abundant food, growing populations, and human ambition. The first cities were laboratories of civilization, where people tested ideas about governance, society, trade, technology, and culture. Every street, canal, and building reflects the interplay of necessity and creativity, survival and imagination. They laid the foundation for writing, administration, and large-scale governance, the tools that would allow human societies to grow beyond anything previously imagined. As the sun continues its journey across the skies of ancient Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and China, we glimpse the earliest heartbeat of urban life. Streets fill with activity, workshops echo with labor, temples hum with ritual, and markets buzz with trade. Civilization has begun its first great experiment, to organize humans not as scattered groups, but as coordinated, interdependent communities capable of innovation, resilience, and enduring legacy. The rise of these cities marks the first step in humanity's journey from survival to society, from scattered villages to complex civilizations. The first cities did not arise by accident. They were the result of careful planning, observation, and experimentation, a deliberate attempt to organize human life at a scale previously unimaginable. At the heart of this innovation was urban planning, a recognition that streets, blocks, and public spaces could shape the daily rhythms of tens of thousands of people. In cities like Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements along the Yellow River, urban design was not merely functional. It was a reflection of social priorities, religious beliefs, and economic necessities. In Uruk, one of the earliest known cities in human history, streets were more than dirt paths. They formed arteries of human activity, connecting homes, markets, temples, and administrative centers. The city's planners understood that movement and accessibility were critical. Narrow alleys led to domestic quarters, while broader avenues accommodated carts carrying grain, livestock, and trade goods. Public squares emerged as spaces of assembly, ritual, and commerce, allowing the city to function not just as a collection of buildings, but as a living, breathing organism. Every street had a purpose, and the flow of people, goods, and ideas depended on it. Mohenjo-Daro, in the Indus Valley, demonstrates urban planning at an unprecedented level of precision. Archaeologists have uncovered a city laid out in a perfect grid, with streets intersecting at right angles, houses organized into blocks, and public spaces strategically placed for accessibility and efficiency. The city's planners anticipated the needs of a dense population. Streets were wide enough for pedestrian and vehicular traffic. Drains lined the edges to prevent flooding, and neighborhoods were divided logically to balance residential, commercial, and ritual functions. This was urban planning as both science and art, a vision of society rendered in brick, mortar, and careful measurement. Public spaces played a central role in early cities, serving as hubs of social, religious, and economic activity. In Uruk, temples and ziggurats dominated the cityscape, their elevated platforms visible from almost every street. These spaces were not just spiritual centers, they functioned as civic landmarks, organizing the city around shared points of reference. Markets and plazas provided areas for exchange, debate, and social interaction. In Mohenjo-Daro, large open courtyards and central squares suggest communal gathering places for festivals, trade, and administration. Even in early Chinese settlements, open spaces were integrated with the natural landscape, creating focal points for both domestic and civic life. The design of streets and grids also reflected an understanding of hierarchy and order. In Uruk, the separation of residential areas for elites and commoners helped maintain social structure while facilitating urban efficiency. Streets leading to temples or palaces were broader, more formal, and often adorned with monumental architecture. In Mohenjo-Daro, neighborhood layouts allowed for equitable access to water and public facilities, ensuring that urban life could function smoothly for all inhabitants. Even seemingly small details, the placement of a well, the width of an alley, or the orientation of a house, were carefully considered, demonstrating a sophisticated grasp of urban dynamics. Urban planning was also intimately linked to environmental management. In the Indus Valley, for example, streets were slightly elevated to prevent flooding, and drainage systems carried excess water away from homes. In Uruk, proximity to canals and rivers influenced street orientation and access to trade routes. Early Chinese planners considered river courses, soil fertility, and seasonal flooding when designing their settlements. Cities were designed not only for human convenience but also to coexist with the natural world, balancing expansion with sustainability. The grid pattern in Mohenjo-Daro, with its rectangular blocks and uniform streets, illustrates a remarkable level of foresight. Streets were often aligned north-south and east-west, allowing for efficient sunlight exposure and ventilation. Houses were built with standardized bricks, facilitating both construction and maintenance. Public buildings were strategically placed to serve neighborhoods. Markets were centrally located to maximize accessibility, and temples occupied elevated sites to signify spiritual authority. This kind of planning reflects a profound understanding of how human settlements function, not just in terms of individual households, but as complex systems of interaction. Streets and public spaces were also conduits of culture. In Uruk, ceremonial processions wound through main avenues, connecting temples, administrative centers, and marketplaces. These processions reinforced social hierarchy, religious devotion, and civic identity. Markets were spaces where goods from distant regions were exchanged, but they were also arenas for storytelling, education, and the spread of ideas. The urban grid, therefore, was not merely a practical tool. It was a framework for social and cultural life, shaping how people lived, worked, and interacted. In early Chinese cities, streets were often integrated with natural features such as rivers, hills, and floodplains. Planners recognized the need to adapt to the environment, while still maintaining order and accessibility. Courtyards and open spaces provided ventilation, sunlight, and communal gathering areas, while the layout of homes and streets facilitated both privacy and social cohesion. These settlements demonstrate that urban planning was not a single formula, but a set of principles adapted to geography, culture, and societal needs. Another important aspect of urban planning was security. In Uruk, walls enclosed the city, with gates controlling access and providing defense against potential invaders. Streets within the city were laid out to facilitate patrols and rapid movement of guards. In Mohenjo-Daro, while the walls were less monumental, they still provided protection, and street layouts allowed for surveillance and organized defense. Early Chinese cities similarly incorporated defensive considerations, with elevated platforms, walls, and strategically placed entrances. Urban planning, therefore, was inseparable from the need to protect both people and resources. The planning of streets, grids, and public spaces also shaped daily life in subtle ways. Residents navigated the city along predictable routes, moving from home to market to temple with relative ease. Courtyards allowed light and air into homes, while streets facilitated social interaction. Neighborhoods were organized to encourage cohesion within the community, while public spaces allowed for broader engagement with the city as a whole. The physical design of the city influenced human behavior, creating routines, patterns, and rhythms that defined life for its inhabitants. Urban planning was a foundation for future innovations. By establishing predictable layouts and organized public spaces, early cities created the conditions for trade, administration, and cultural development. Scribes could record transactions because marketplaces were predictable and centralized. Priests could coordinate rituals because temples were prominent and accessible. Laborers and artisans could specialize because neighborhoods and workshops were systematically arranged. The city itself became a framework for human activity, enabling complexity to flourish. Across Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements, we see the emergence of principles that continue to inform urban planning today. Accessibility, hierarchy, environmental adaptation, public utility, cultural integration, and security. Streets are not merely passageways. They are channels for life, commerce, ritual, and interaction. Grids are not only mathematical, they are social tools, organizing space for efficiency and cohesion. Public spaces are more than empty ground. They are arenas for collective identity, governance, and culture. In the early cities of the world, urban planning was both an art and a necessity. It reflected the ambitions, needs, and creativity of their inhabitants. It allowed large populations to coexist, interact, and thrive. It provided order in a world increasingly complex, balancing private life with public activity, work with ritual, and survival with culture. The streets, grids, and public spaces of Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese cities were the arteries, skeletons, and hearts of the first urban civilizations, spaces that shaped human behavior, facilitated growth, and allowed the experiment of city life to succeed. As we wander mentally through these ancient streets, we can almost hear the sounds of life: carts rolling over packed earth, water flowing through drains, merchants calling out their wares, children laughing in courtyards, priests chanting in temples. The design of the city guides these sounds, orders them, and integrates them into a coherent rhythm. Urban planning is not abstract. It is lived, experienced, and felt. It is the invisible hand shaping daily life, connecting individual actions to collective purpose, and linking the present moment to the enduring legacy of civilization. In understanding streets, grids, and public spaces, we grasp the essence of early urban life. Cities were complex systems, balancing efficiency, social order, environmental adaptation, culture, and security. Every decision, from the placement of a well to the width of a main avenue, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how human settlements could function at scale. Urban planning was both a technical achievement and a social experiment, one that would define the trajectory of civilization for thousands of years to come. The streets and grids of Uruk, the orderly blocks of Mohenjo-Daro, and the adaptive layouts of early Chinese cities are more than archaeological curiosities. They are evidence of human ingenuity, cooperation, and foresight. They remind us that civilization did not emerge spontaneously. It was carefully constructed, shaped by vision, labor, and necessity. Every street and public space tells a story, revealing the priorities, values, and ambitions of the people who lived, worked, and dreamed within these first cities. The streets of the first cities were alive with movement, but behind every wall and alley, domestic life thrived in ways that reveal both the ingenuity and the daily struggles of early urban inhabitants. Housing in Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements was not merely a shelter. It was a reflection of social status, family structure, technological innovation, and cultural values. Each home, whether a modest dwelling for laborers or an elaborate residence for elites, tells the story of human adaptation to city life. In Uruk, houses were generally constructed from sun-dried mud bricks, a material both abundant and flexible, allowing builders to shape walls, foundations, and even small courtyards. Families often lived in multi-roomed structures, each space serving a distinct purpose: storage rooms for grain, workshops for crafts, sleeping quarters, and spaces for ritual or communal activity. Homes were clustered in neighborhoods, creating semi-private zones while remaining accessible to streets and public spaces. The careful placement of windows, doorways, and inner courtyards allowed air circulation, light, and even limited privacy, elements essential for comfort and daily functioning. In Mohenjo-Daro, the sophistication of domestic architecture is striking. Houses were often 2 stories, with flat roofs that could serve as additional living or workspace. Interiors were carefully divided. The ground floor might house kitchens and workshops, while the upper floor provided private sleeping quarters. Standardized brick sizes suggest that construction followed strict guidelines, enabling efficiency, uniformity, and durability. Many homes featured internal courtyards, which functioned as centers for cooking, storage, and family gatherings. These courtyards were essential in dense urban settings, offering light, ventilation, and social space within the confines of a single property. Water access was a crucial aspect of domestic life. In Mohenjo-Daro, public wells were available to neighborhoods, but many homes also had private water access or small reservoirs in courtyards. Bathing facilities, sometimes elaborate with brick drains, were integrated into homes, reflecting an understanding of hygiene and the cultural importance of cleanliness. In Uruk, proximity to canals and water sources influenced residential layouts, ensuring that households could sustain themselves even as the city grew. Early Chinese settlements employed similar strategies, situating homes near streams or wells and often raising floors to prevent flooding, demonstrating an awareness of both comfort and environmental hazard. The arrangement of space within houses also reflected family structure and gender roles. In many early urban societies, households were extended, encompassing multiple generations under one roof. Sleeping areas were partitioned to provide privacy, while communal spaces fostered interaction among family members. Kitchens and food preparation areas were often the domain of women, serving not only as sites of sustenance but also as centers of social and domestic labor. Workspaces for crafts, such as weaving or pottery, were frequently attached to or integrated within the home, allowing artisans to produce goods while attending to family responsibilities. Social stratification was clearly visible in housing. Elite residences were larger, often adorned with decorative elements, multiple rooms, and private courtyards. In Uruk, some homes were located near temples or administrative centers, indicating proximity to power and influence. These residences might include storage for surplus goods, spaces for entertaining guests, and rooms dedicated to religious practice. By contrast, common households were smaller, more utilitarian, and often clustered tightly along narrow streets. Yet even these modest homes reflected careful design. They were oriented for sunlight, airflow, and efficient use of space, demonstrating that functionality was valued across social strata. Furniture and interior features also reveal much about domestic life. Simple platforms or raised sleeping areas, mats, low stools, and storage chests provided comfort and organization. Hearths or small ovens allowed cooking within enclosed spaces, while niches in walls stored tools, pottery, and personal items. In Mohenjo-Daro, Some homes included built-in brick platforms and benches, indicating attention to ergonomics and daily use. Decorative elements, from painted walls to carved motifs, highlight the aesthetic sensibilities of inhabitants and the importance of personal and family identity within the home. Food storage and preparation were central to domestic life. Large clay jars, granaries, and storage pits kept surplus grain and legumes safe from pests and moisture. Kitchens were designed to accommodate daily cooking, often incorporating small hearths, work surfaces, and areas for food processing. In cities dependent on agricultural surplus, proper storage and preparation were essential not only for individual households, but for the stability of the broader urban population. Malfunctions in storage or waste management could ripple outward, affecting neighborhoods and even the city at large. Daily life within homes was interwoven with broader urban rhythms. Neighborhood streets allowed residents to access markets, workshops, and temples with relative ease. Children played in courtyards or alleyways under the watchful eyes of parents or older siblings. Artisans produced goods that would be traded locally or exported, while women and men maintained the household's daily functions. Religious observances were often conducted at home, sometimes in small shrines or dedicated rooms, integrating personal belief with civic practice. Domestic life was therefore both private and public, intimate yet deeply connected to the rhythms of the city itself. Hygiene and sanitation were key concerns. In Mohenjo-Daro, homes often connected directly to drainage systems, allowing wastewater to flow away from living spaces. Courtyards and elevated platforms prevented water accumulation and minimized disease risk. In Uruk, similar considerations guided the placement of homes relative to canals and communal facilities. These innovations reflect an understanding of health and environmental management that was critical in dense urban settings. Even in early Chinese settlements, housing layouts took into account flood prevention, airflow, and sunlight exposure, emphasizing that urban domestic design was as much about survival as it was about comfort. Privacy and social interaction coexisted in complex ways. Inner courtyards, partitioned rooms, and elevated sleeping areas provided seclusion for family members, while doorways and external access allowed interaction with neighbors and the broader urban community. Houses were microcosms of the city itself, balancing individuality and collective responsibility. Residents were not isolated. Their lives were structured by the city's design, creating rhythms of movement, labor, and interaction that defined early urban life. Craft production and domestic economy were deeply intertwined. Homes often doubled as workshops, particularly in the case of artisans producing pottery, textiles, or tools. The proximity of workspaces to living quarters allowed families to sustain their livelihoods while remaining integrated into urban society. Neighborhoods sometimes developed specialties. One block might be dominated by potters, another by weavers, another by metalworkers, showing how domestic space and urban planning combined to support economic efficiency. Lighting and heating were managed ingeniously within homes. Small oil lamps provided illumination, while hearths or ovens offered warmth and a center for cooking. Roofs were sometimes flat, allowing people to sleep under the stars during hot seasons or to dry crops and textiles. Ventilation, window placement, and the orientation of rooms demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of comfort and practicality, ensuring that homes were livable even in dense, bustling cities. Finally, domestic life was a crucible for culture. Stories were told, songs sung, rituals observed, and knowledge transmitted within the walls of homes. Children learned skills from parents, women maintained dietary and medicinal practices, and men engaged in craft or trade work. Homes were the incubators of society, nurturing the habits, values, and knowledge that allowed urban civilization to thrive. They were spaces of intimacy, productivity, and learning, reflecting both individual needs and collective organization. In examining the housing and domestic life of early cities, one realizes that urban life was more than streets and walls. It was built from the people who inhabited those spaces. From the mud brick houses of Uruk to the courtyard homes of Mohenjo-Daro and the elevated compounds of early Chinese settlements, every structure tells a story of adaptation, creativity, and social organization. These dwellings enabled the emergence of complex societies, supporting population growth, labor specialization, and cultural development. They were the foundation upon which urban life could flourish, creating the environment for trade, administration, and community that defined the first cities. Domestic life in these early cities reveals a remarkable balance between necessity and aspiration. People organized their homes to meet practical needs while also expressing identity, status, and cultural values. The architecture reflects adaptation to environment, population density, and urban infrastructure. The interior spaces demonstrate attention to family structure, social hierarchy, work, and ritual. In short, housing was not passive. It was an active participant in the experiment of early urban civilization. The story of domestic life continues to echo through history. The organization of homes, the rhythms of daily work, and the interplay between private and public spaces in Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese cities laid the groundwork for centuries of urban development. Understanding these spaces allows us to imagine life in the first cities. Not only their physical structure, but the people who animated them, the routines they followed, and the social bonds they maintained. Every brick, every courtyard, every hearth is a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of early urban populations. Water is life, and in the first cities, managing it was a question of survival. Unlike scattered villages where natural water sources could be accessed freely, urban life concentrated thousands of people into compact spaces. This density created both opportunity and risk. While cities could support craft production, trade, and social interaction, they also faced the constant threat of contamination, disease, and flooding. To endure, early civilizations developed some of humanity's first large-scale water and sanitation systems, wells, drainage channels, and sewage networks that reflected ingenuity, foresight, and a profound understanding of urban needs. In Mohenjo-Daro, one of the crown jewels of the Indus Valley civilization, water infrastructure is astonishing in its sophistication. Archaeologists have uncovered a network of wells, many built of precisely shaped bricks, positioned strategically to ensure access to fresh water for every neighborhood. Some wells were communal, serving dozens of households, while others were located directly within private homes, allowing families convenient access for drinking, cooking, and hygiene. The consistent depth and structure of these wells indicate careful planning and knowledge of the water table, demonstrating that early city planners combined practical engineering with environmental observation. Drainage in Mohenjo-Daro was equally impressive. Streets were lined with brick channels, slightly raised above the ground, guiding wastewater away from homes and communal areas. Many houses had private drains that connected directly to these channels, enabling the safe disposal of household waste. Larger, citywide drains carried effluent to rivers or designated areas outside the city, reducing standing water and minimizing the risk of disease. This system represents one of the earliest known examples of integrated urban sanitation, where public health concerns were addressed not only through access to water, but through systematic waste management. Uruk in Mesopotamia approached water management on a larger, landscape-driven scale. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were lifelines, providing irrigation for agriculture as well as water for urban populations. Canals crisscrossed the region, both inside and outside the city, ensuring a consistent water supply for households, workshops, and public spaces. Seasonal flooding posed challenges, and city planners responded by constructing levees, raised embankments, and channels that diverted excess water while protecting streets and homes. These measures reflect an early understanding of hydrology and the necessity of balancing human settlement with natural cycles. Early Chinese cities along the Yellow River also faced the dual threat of periodic floods and the need for reliable water. Settlements were built on raised platforms, streets and homes oriented to minimize water accumulation. Wells and communal water points ensured access for daily domestic needs, while drainage channels and small canals directed excess water safely away from streets and living areas. These design choices show a sophisticated awareness of the environment and its challenges, with planning focused both on convenience and on the health and safety of inhabitants. Access to water was deeply intertwined with social life. Wells were not merely functional, they were social hubs. Residents drew water collectively, fostering interactions that reinforced community cohesion. Women and children were primarily responsible for fetching water, a task that structured daily routines and family labor. Markets, workshops, and public baths depended on nearby water sources, and priests used water for purification rituals. Wells, canals, and cisterns were thus central to both survival and culture, illustrating the multifaceted importance of water in early cities. Sanitation extended far beyond the removal of waste. It was central to urban planning and public health. In Mohenjo-Daro, brick-lined drains were designed with attention to gradient, flow, and accessibility for maintenance. Wastewater from homes and public spaces flowed through these channels into larger conduits, preventing the accumulation of stagnant water that could harbor disease. Some neighborhoods featured communal bathing platforms connected to the drainage system, suggesting that cleanliness was both practical and ritualized. In Uruk, similar attention was paid to managing stormwater and household effluent, reflecting an understanding of hygiene's centrality to urban life. Technology and engineering were at the heart of these systems. Builders had to calculate the slope of drains to ensure consistent flow, construct durable linings to prevent erosion, and design connections from individual homes to main channels. Wells had to reach dependable water tables while preventing contamination. Canals and diversion channels required careful coordination with urban layouts, streets, and residential zones. These innovations reflect both experimentation and accumulated knowledge, demonstrating that water management was a deliberate, planned component of city life. Water and sanitation were closely linked to social hierarchy. Proximity to wells or clean water points often signified status. Those with private access enjoyed convenience and privacy, while others relied on communal sources. Public baths and sanitation facilities may have been open to broader populations, but their placement and maintenance were controlled by civic authorities or religious institutions. Control over water was thus both a practical necessity and a mechanism of governance, with infrastructure reflecting and reinforcing social organization. Flood management was another critical aspect. The Indus Valley cities, Mesopotamia, and the Yellow River Basin all contended with seasonal water surges. Elevated platforms, levees, and channels allowed cities to survive in areas that would otherwise have been uninhabitable. Streets were sometimes built slightly higher than surrounding plots to allow drainage, and courtyards were designed to collect or channel rainwater. These measures minimized the risk of property damage, crop loss, and disease, highlighting the interplay between natural forces and human ingenuity in shaping urban life. Water and sanitation also supported economic and cultural activities. Markets relied on clean water for both people and goods. Workshops needed water for production, and temples incorporated water into ritual practices. Public and private access to water enabled households to engage in craft work, food preparation, and domestic chores efficiently. Sanitation infrastructure reduced health risks, allowing cities to sustain larger populations and higher densities, which in turn fostered trade, specialization, and cultural exchange. The maintenance of these systems required coordination and organization. City officials or appointed overseers monitored wells, canals, and drains to ensure functionality. Neighborhood groups may have contributed labor for cleaning or minor repairs, creating a sense of shared responsibility. This early urban governance demonstrates that water and sanitation were not only technical challenges, but also social ones, requiring communication, labor organization, and civic engagement. The management of water thus became a defining feature of early city administration. These water systems were also resilient, designed to endure both daily use and extreme events. The durability of brick-lined drains, the consistency of well construction, and the redundancy of multiple water sources show foresight. In Uruk, canals could be rerouted or expanded, while in Mohenjo-Daro, multiple wells and baths ensured that urban life could continue even if individual sources were compromised. Early Chinese platforms and diversion channels allowed settlements to withstand flood cycles, reflecting adaptability and long-term planning. Cultural and ritual significance of water reinforced its centrality. In temples and public baths, water was essential for cleansing, offerings, and symbolic renewal. Public access points were often integrated into ritual spaces, blending civic, domestic, and spiritual life. The daily act of drawing water, washing, or using drainage facilities was therefore both practical and symbolic, connecting inhabitants to the city's physical infrastructure and its social and religious order. Ultimately, wells, drainage, and sewage systems were the veins of early cities. They enabled life, protected health, facilitated economic activity, and reinforced social order. Without these innovations, dense urban populations would have been unsustainable. The ingenuity of early engineers and planners allowed cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Uruk, and early Chinese settlements to grow, thrive, and experiment with complex social structures. Water and sanitation were not merely technical achievements, they were foundational to the very concept of urban civilization. Walking mentally through the streets of these cities, one can imagine residents drawing water from wells, children playing near drainage channels, craftsmen working with clean water for their trades, and priests performing purification rituals. The constant hum of daily life was sustained by these systems, often invisible but essential. Water management connected households, neighborhoods, and entire urban populations, supporting every aspect of city life. In examining early water and sanitation systems, we recognize that urbanization was not just a social or economic phenomenon, it was a technological one. The ability to control water, dispose of waste, and mitigate environmental risks was fundamental to creating cities capable of sustaining large populations. Wells, drains, and sewage channels were more than infrastructure. They were expressions of human foresight, cooperation, and ingenuity. The study of these systems allows us to appreciate the skill and vision of ancient engineers who, without modern tools or scientific theory, created durable, functional, and socially integrated solutions. Their work ensured that life in the first cities could continue day after day, season after season, year after year. Water and sanitation shaped not only the physical form of these cities, but the daily lives, health, and culture of their inhabitants. In the first cities, the monumental structures that rose above ordinary dwellings were more than symbols of power or wealth. They were the heart of civic and spiritual life. Temples, ziggurats, and other public architecture in cities like Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements were carefully designed to inspire awe, organize social activity, and reinforce cultural identity. These buildings represented both technological mastery and symbolic intent, their size and design reflecting the ambitions and beliefs of early urban societies. In Uruk, temples were central to the cityscape, dominating both skyline and social consciousness. The Anu ziggurat, for instance, was more than a place of worship. It was a focal point around which the city's streets, homes, and markets were oriented. Elevated on massive platforms, the ziggurat's height symbolized the connection between earth and the divine, emphasizing the authority of the priesthood and the city's spiritual significance. Processions, festivals, and ceremonies were conducted along the broad avenues leading to the temple, integrating religious practice into the daily life of the city. These monumental structures were both practical centers for ritual and symbolic anchors for communal identity. Mohenjo-Daro, in contrast, emphasizes the civic and functional role of public architecture. While it lacks the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia, it features the Great Bath, a large, carefully constructed pool thought to serve both ritualistic and communal purposes. This building demonstrates precise engineering, including waterproofed brickwork, drainage systems, and steps leading into the water. The Great Bath was likely a communal space, blending hygiene, religious ritual, and social gathering. Its central location within the city underscores the role of public architecture in shaping urban life, providing spaces for congregation and reinforcing shared values. Early Chinese settlements also integrated monumental architecture into urban layouts, though with different stylistic and symbolic priorities. Large platforms, palatial compounds, and ceremonial enclosures served as centers for governance, ritual, and elite residence. Temples and altars were often oriented according to cosmological principles, aligned with cardinal directions or natural features such as rivers and hills. Public architecture in these cities was deeply connected to both spiritual and political authority, reinforcing hierarchy and integrating daily life with broader cultural frameworks. Temples and ziggurats were designed to be visible from across the city, creating visual focal points that guided movement and behavior. Their placement dictated street layouts, neighborhood organization, and public gathering areas. In Uruk, the main ziggurat towered over residential districts, asserting both spiritual and civic dominance. In Mohenjo-Daro, communal buildings like the Great Bath or assembly halls served a similar function, providing orientation points and central hubs for activity. Even in early Chinese cities, elevated ceremonial platforms acted as visual anchors, linking residential zones with spaces of governance and ritual. The construction of these monumental buildings required advanced technical knowledge, careful planning, and considerable labor. Massive quantities of mud brick, stone, and timber were transported, shaped and assembled with precision. In Uruk, ziggurats were built with layers of sun-dried and baked bricks, carefully bonded to support immense weight. Stairways, ramps, and terraces were engineered to facilitate movement of people and materials. In Mohenjo-Daro, the waterproofing and leveling of the Great Bath reveal a sophisticated understanding of materials, hydraulics, and structural integrity. Early Chinese ceremonial platforms were similarly engineered to endure floods, seismic activity, and the passage of time. Public architecture also served as a medium for communication and storytelling. Reliefs, carvings, and inscriptions adorned temple walls, depicting gods, mythologies, rulers, and civic events. These visual narratives reinforced cultural values, recorded achievements, and instructed citizens in social norms. In Uruk, clay tablets and relief carvings in temple precincts conveyed religious and administrative messages, merging literacy, ritual, and public space. Mohenjo-Daro's architecture, while less overtly decorated, still communicated civic pride, order, and functionality through design, symmetry, and spatial organization. The social function of monumental architecture extended beyond religious ritual. Public buildings were arenas for festivals, markets, and assemblies. Courtyards, terraces, and plazas provided space for citizens to gather, negotiate, and celebrate. Ziggurats and temples reinforced the centrality of collective life, drawing residents into shared activities that fostered civic cohesion. In Mohenjo-Daro, the Great Bath may have been a site for initiation, purification, or public ritual, blending private devotion with community participation. Early Chinese ceremonial compounds similarly hosted gatherings that reinforced social hierarchy, political authority, and cultural cohesion. Symbolism in architecture was deliberate and profound. Height, scale, and orientation conveyed power and cosmological order. Ziggurats elevated priests closer to the divine, emphasizing their spiritual authority. In Mohenjo-Daro, public baths and halls signified communal well-being and urban sophistication. In early Chinese cities, ceremonial platforms aligned with natural features and cardinal directions linked human society with cosmic order. Architecture was thus a physical manifestation of social, political, and spiritual ideals, shaping not only space but behavior, perception, and identity. Engineering ingenuity was also evident in the integration of utility into monumental structures. Ziggurats incorporated internal chambers, staircases, and terraces that facilitated processions and ritual practice. The Great Bath in Mohenjo-Daro included drains, steps, and waterproofed surfaces that enabled repeated use. Early Chinese ceremonial enclosures were often fortified, raised, and oriented to ensure durability and accessibility. Monumental architecture, therefore, was not only symbolic but highly functional, balancing aesthetics, ritual needs, and practical urban demands. Monumental architecture reflected social stratification. In Uruk, temples and ziggurats were closely associated with the elite priesthood, who controlled ritual, administration, and surplus resources. Residential neighborhoods for commoners were located farther from these monumental centers, although streets, markets, and public spaces connected them to ceremonial life. In Mohenjo-Daro, communal buildings were accessible to a wider population, though elite residences still occupied central or prominent locations. Early Chinese ceremonial compounds emphasized hierarchy through spatial arrangement, elevation, and restricted access. Architecture thus reinforced social structures while providing spaces for collective identity. Public spaces associated with monumental architecture encouraged observation and participation. Processions, festivals, and daily movement brought citizens into contact with these buildings, fostering a sense of shared culture. Streets converged on temples, ziggurats, and communal halls, ensuring that monumental architecture was experienced both physically and symbolically. Residents internalized the presence and authority of these structures through repeated interaction, integrating civic and spiritual ideals into everyday life. Religious and civic functions often overlapped. Temples served as centers of economic administration, storage for offerings or tribute, and coordination points for labor projects. Ziggurats symbolized divine authority while supporting practical city needs such as flood monitoring, astronomical observation, or ritual ceremonies tied to agricultural cycles. Early Chinese ceremonial platforms were venues for both governance and spiritual observance, blending statecraft with ritualized cosmology. Monumental architecture, therefore, exemplified the inseparability of sacred and civic life in early cities. Even today, these structures communicate the priorities, values, and aspirations of their builders. They reveal a culture invested in hierarchy, ritual, communal identity, and long-term urban sustainability. The scale and precision of construction reflect labor organization, resource management, and technological capability. Through ziggurats, temples, baths, and ceremonial platforms, early cities broadcast their authority, spirituality, and civic sophistication to both residents and neighboring settlements. Monumental architecture also functioned as a teaching tool, demonstrating social, religious, and political principles through form and function. Citizens learned hierarchy, ritual observance, and civic responsibility by observing and interacting with these spaces. The architecture codified knowledge, guiding human behavior through spatial experience rather than written instruction alone. Streets, stairways, plazas, and terraces structured movement, attention, and interaction, embedding societal norms into the physical city. In essence, monumental architecture made the city legible. Ziggurats, temples, and public buildings provided orientation, social cues, and visual hierarchy. They connected private life with civic and religious life, giving residents a tangible sense of order, authority, and purpose. They were both practical and symbolic, shaping daily routines while inspiring awe, devotion, and civic pride. The grandeur of these structures tells a story of ambition, organization, and belief, reflecting the complex interplay between humans, society, and the divine. As one imagines walking through the first cities, the scale and significance of monumental architecture become clear. Citizens navigated streets converging on ziggurats, gathered in plazas beside communal baths, and participated in rituals that integrated every aspect of urban life. These buildings were living symbols of society's values, simultaneously functional, ceremonial, and didactic. Monumental architecture was the heartbeat of the first cities, shaping experience, memory, and identity in ways that endured for centuries. As the first cities emerged, their inhabitants were no longer just a collection of families and clans. They became members of increasingly complex social hierarchies. Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements illustrate how urban life brought differentiation in wealth, occupation, and privilege. Social stratification was not simply a byproduct of size. It was a mechanism that structured labor, maintained order, and supported the growing administrative and religious apparatus of these early urban centers. Understanding the lives of elites, artisans, and laborers allows us to glimpse the delicate social balance that sustained city life and facilitated its unprecedented complexity. At the top of the hierarchy were the elites, often composed of rulers, high-ranking priests, administrators, and wealthy merchants. In Uruk, elite households were located near temples or central plazas, reflecting their proximity to both spiritual and administrative authority. These residents lived in large, multi-roomed houses, often adorned with decorative motifs, multiple courtyards, and private storage for surplus goods. Their homes were constructed with higher quality materials and greater attention to durability, comfort, and aesthetic appeal. The elite's position was not only social but functional. They controlled resources, orchestrated labor, and oversaw public and religious works, making their influence felt across every aspect of urban life. In Mohenjo-Daro, elites similarly occupied prominent locations, often in the city's central sectors. Archaeological evidence suggests that they had access to private wells, bathing platforms, and storage for surplus grain, giving them both practical advantages and symbolic prestige. Their homes may have included space for administrative activities, reinforcing their role as intermediaries between the general population and governing authorities. By controlling resources and labor, elites ensured the smooth functioning of the city while reinforcing social boundaries that separated them from the majority of inhabitants. Artisans formed the next layer of the social pyramid. Skilled in pottery, weaving, metallurgy, or brick-making, they were essential to urban economies. Artisans often lived in neighborhoods adjacent to workshops, where they could combine residence and production. In Uruk, pottery workshops were concentrated in specific districts, suggesting planned zones for craft activity. Artisans were highly valued for their specialized skills, yet their wealth and influence were limited compared to elites. Their labor supported both domestic life and public infrastructure, producing goods for trade, ceremonial use, and everyday consumption. In Mohenjo-Daro, workshops within or near homes reflect a similar pattern, where families combined residence with craft production, blending domestic and economic activity seamlessly. Laborers occupied the broad base of the social structure. Their work encompassed construction, transport, agriculture, sanitation, and other physically demanding tasks that sustained urban life. Streets, canals, drainage systems, and monumental architecture all depended on the laborers' effort, yet their living conditions were modest. Homes were smaller, often clustered tightly in denser neighborhoods, reflecting both economic limitations and the practical demands of urban proximity. Despite fewer material privileges, laborers were critical to the city's functioning, their contributions forming the foundation of both daily life and long-term growth. Social stratification was reinforced through housing, access to resources, and occupational specialization. Elite neighborhoods were spacious, well-constructed, and centrally located. Artisans lived near production zones, often balancing domestic and workshop needs. Laborers were concentrated in peripheral or densely packed areas, sometimes near canals, workshops, or marketplaces, where their labor was most immediately needed. These spatial arrangements physically manifested social hierarchy, creating a cityscape that mirrored societal organization. The division of labor also reinforced social differentiation. Elites rarely engaged in manual work. Their value lay in administration, ritual, or oversight. Artisans specialized in one or a few crafts, ensuring skill mastery and economic contribution, while laborers performed essential but less specialized tasks. This organization allowed cities to sustain high levels of productivity and efficiency, enabling the construction of monumental architecture, the maintenance of sanitation systems, and the production of surplus goods for trade. Each role was interdependent, creating a social ecosystem in which hierarchy was both functional and symbolic. Access to education, literacy, and administrative knowledge further distinguished elites from other classes. In Uruk, priests and scribes controlled cuneiform writing, managing records of trade, tribute, and religious practice. Literacy and numeracy were privileges closely guarded, reinforcing the social gap between the educated elite and the largely illiterate majority. Artisans and laborers were generally excluded from formal administrative knowledge, though they contributed to record-keeping indirectly through production and specialized craft output. This control over information, along with economic and spiritual authority, ensured that elites maintained influence over both material and symbolic resources. Religious authority was deeply intertwined with social stratification. In cities like Uruk and early Chinese settlements, priests occupied a unique space between elite governance and public ritual. They administered temple complexes, supervised ceremonial activities, and controlled surplus resources. Their dual role as spiritual intermediaries and economic managers reinforced hierarchical structures, as devotion, labor, and tribute flowed through temple institutions. The prominence of temples and monumental religious architecture reflected this social hierarchy, making spiritual authority both visible and integrated into urban life. In Mohenjo-Daro, evidence suggests a slightly different social arrangement, with more subtle distinctions between elites and commoners. While wealthy families had advantages in size and amenities of their homes, communal spaces like the Great Bath were accessible to a broader population. Artisans and laborers were essential to city infrastructure and production, but the delineation between classes may have been less rigid than in Mesopotamia. Nevertheless, urban organization, occupational specialization, and access to resources still created clear social stratification. Economic control was another key marker of status. Elites often oversaw trade, stored surplus grain, and directed labor. Artisans produced goods for sale, religious offerings, or household use, and their economic activity was integral to city sustainability. Laborers, while essential for production, had limited control over surplus or trade, and their economic options were constrained by their position within the urban hierarchy. Social mobility was limited but not impossible. Skilled artisans or administrators could gain favor, marry into elite households, or accrue wealth, demonstrating that social boundaries, while structured, were negotiable under certain circumstances. The physical manifestation of social hierarchy extended to clothing, diet, and daily routines. Elites wore garments made from fine textiles, adorned with jewelry or ceremonial items, reflecting status and wealth. Artisans' clothing was practical yet functional, suitable for craft work, while laborers wore simple, durable attire adapted to the physical demands of their tasks. Food access and variety also reflected class distinctions. Elites enjoyed richer diets and stored surplus provisions. Artisans had moderate diversity in food, and laborers relied on staples. These distinctions reinforced the visual and material cues of social differentiation throughout urban life. Neighborhood interaction created both cooperation and tension. While elites, artisans, and laborers were spatially and socially differentiated, daily life required interaction. Markets, temples, workshops, and public spaces served as points of contact, negotiation, and collaboration. Artisans supplied goods to elites. Laborers constructed monumental architecture. Priests mediated rituals that involved all classes. Social stratification was thus both a structure of hierarchy and a framework for interdependence, allowing cities to function efficiently while maintaining clear social divisions. Cultural expression further reinforced hierarchy. Elite households sponsored religious festivals, commissioned monumental architecture, or controlled artistic production. Artisans translated these commissions into tangible forms, pottery, textiles, and sculptures, while laborers provided the physical means of construction and maintenance. The resulting culture reflected a hierarchy of production and patronage, where each class contributed to urban identity according to skill, position, and access to resources. In early Chinese settlements, similar patterns emerged. Elites controlled ceremonial spaces and political authority, artisans produced ritual and practical objects, and laborers supported construction, agriculture, and maintenance. Hierarchy was reinforced through spatial planning, occupational specialization, and ritualized governance. Monumental architecture, administrative records, and ceremonial practices visually and materially codified these divisions, embedding social stratification into the very fabric of the city. By examining the stratification of elites, artisans, and laborers, one can appreciate how early cities balanced complexity and stability. Hierarchy provided order, ensured productivity, and facilitated governance, while occupational specialization enabled innovation and economic resilience. The interaction of these classes created the social ecosystem necessary for urban life to flourish, supporting monumental architecture, craft production, trade, and ritual practice. Social differentiation was thus both a product and a necessity of early urban civilization, reflecting the organization required to sustain large, densely populated, and culturally vibrant communities. Urban life without social stratification would have been chaotic. The delineation of roles, resources, and authority allowed cities to function effectively, coordinate labor, and manage surplus production. It shaped daily routines, access to amenities, and interactions between neighborhoods. At the same time, social stratification inspired aspiration, competition, and innovation, as individuals and families sought to improve their position through skill, service, or association with elite households. Ultimately, the stratification of early cities was a delicate balance. Elites wielded authority and controlled resources. Artisans provided the skilled labor and cultural output necessary for urban life. Laborers sustained the infrastructure and daily functionality of the city. Together, these classes formed a network of interdependence, structured by spatial organization, occupation, ritual, and governance. By understanding these relationships, we gain insight into the inner workings of the first cities and the human ingenuity that allowed complex societies to emerge from simple settlements. The emergence of the first cities was accompanied by the rise of complex trade networks, both within urban centers and stretching across regions. Trade was not merely an economic activity, it was a lifeline, a vehicle for cultural exchange, and a mechanism that enabled cities like Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements to flourish. As populations grew and social stratification became more pronounced, the need for coordinated distribution of goods, resources, and luxuries became a central feature of urban life, shaping both city layouts and interregional interactions. Within cities, marketplaces were the hub of daily commerce. Streets often converged on open-air market areas, plazas, or public courtyards where merchants and artisans could display their wares. In Uruk, excavations reveal evidence of specialized trade districts where pottery, textiles, metalwork, and foodstuffs were exchanged. These districts were strategically located near residential neighborhoods to facilitate access for both consumers and suppliers. Marketplaces were vibrant centers of social interaction, as well as sites where the social hierarchy of the city played out. Elites purchased luxury items, artisans supplied crafted goods, and laborers acquired staples for daily living. Mohenjo-Daro's urban planning also reflects the importance of trade within the city. Streets were laid out to provide easy access to workshops, granaries, and storage facilities. Craft production was often situated close to residential areas, allowing artisans to sell their products directly to neighbors or through organized market spaces. Standardized weights and measures discovered in the city suggest that trade was regulated, ensuring fairness and facilitating transactions across neighborhoods. These internal trade networks allowed for the efficient circulation of essential goods, from food and water containers to textiles and pottery, sustaining the population and enabling economic specialization. Trade between cities was equally vital. Uruk, located near the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, benefited from a network of waterways that facilitated the movement of goods both upstream and downstream. Timber, metals, precious stones, and luxury goods flowed into Uruk from distant regions, while surplus grain, textiles, and crafted items were exported to neighboring settlements. The ability to engage in interregional trade enhanced the city's wealth, supported its elites, and encouraged technological and cultural exchange. Trade also played a role in diplomacy, as goods served as tribute, gifts, or incentives to maintain alliances with other city-states. Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus Valley cities participated in extensive trade networks across South and Central Asia. Artifacts such as carnelian beads, seals, and standardized weights indicate a sophisticated system of exchange. Goods moved not only along rivers and coastal routes but also overland via caravans, linking cities hundreds of kilometers apart. Trade required coordination and record-keeping. Inscriptions on seals and tablets suggest a system of accounting and administrative oversight, illustrating that early commerce was inseparable from governance and social organization. Early Chinese cities along the Yellow River also developed trade networks, though the focus was often on agricultural surplus, ceramics, and metal tools. Local markets facilitated the distribution of grain, vegetables, and craft goods, while longer-distance trade brought in salt, jade, and other materials not locally available. Exchange was not only economic but also cultural, transmitting ideas, technology, and ritual practices between communities. The integration of trade into city planning demonstrates that economic activity was a fundamental driver of urban layout and societal development. The organization of trade networks depended on infrastructure. Streets, bridges, canals, and storage facilities were all designed to support the efficient movement of goods. In Uruk, wide avenues allowed carts and pack animals to transport heavy items, while quays and river docks enabled loading and unloading of goods. In Mohenjo-Daro, access to wells, drains, and granaries ensured that storage and sanitation were compatible with commercial activity. Early Chinese cities used raised platforms, covered walkways, and regulated access points to streamline commerce while maintaining public order. Infrastructure was therefore both functional and regulatory, shaping the rhythm of trade within and between cities. Trade also reinforced social hierarchy. Elites controlled the flow of luxury goods, rare metals, and crafted items, consolidating power and demonstrating status. Artisans depended on access to raw materials for production, while laborers supplied goods and services that supported the commercial ecosystem. Marketplaces were arenas where wealth and status were displayed, and social networks were reinforced through transactional relationships. The regulation of trade, through standardized weights, measures, and administrative oversight, reflects the city's capacity to organize complex social and economic systems. Commerce fostered innovation and specialization. Artisans developed new techniques and products to meet demand, merchants honed negotiation and logistical skills, and administrators refined record-keeping and taxation systems. Cities became centers of economic experimentation, where trade networks facilitated the diffusion of technology, craft styles, and cultural practices. For example, the spread of pottery techniques, textile patterns, and metalworking methods across Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and early Chinese settlements highlights how commerce functioned as a conduit for creativity and knowledge transfer. The social and cultural significance of trade extended beyond material exchange. Markets were spaces of interaction, information sharing, and communal experience. Merchants and customers engaged in negotiations that involved social intelligence, trust, and reputation. Festivals and ceremonial events often coincided with trade fairs, reinforcing civic identity while stimulating economic activity. In these settings, trade was as much a social institution as an economic one, intertwining the rhythms of daily life with broader urban and regional networks. Trade also supported urban sustainability. The circulation of food, raw materials, and manufactured goods enabled cities to sustain dense populations, buffer against local shortages, and plan for growth. Granaries, storage facilities, and transportation infrastructure allowed cities to manage surplus and scarcity, linking urban planning with economic resilience. Trade was therefore integral not only to prosperity, but to survival, ensuring that essential goods could reach those in need, and that cities could maintain stability through fluctuating environmental and social conditions. Interregional trade required coordination across political boundaries. Cities negotiated agreements, paid tribute, or established alliances to secure routes and resources. Diplomatic and economic networks were intertwined, as the flow of goods could reinforce loyalty, cement alliances, and facilitate cultural exchange. Trade was thus a mechanism of power, allowing cities to project influence, negotiate security, and participate in broader geopolitical landscapes. The ability to manage trade networks effectively was a marker of civic sophistication and political authority. The circulation of ideas, technology, and culture was a natural consequence of trade. Through commercial interactions, artisans, priests, and merchants encountered foreign techniques, religious practices, and artistic styles. In Uruk, trade with neighboring city-states introduced new pottery designs, construction methods, and symbolic motifs. In Mohenjo-Daro, seals, beads, and standardized weights reflect the adoption and adaptation of practices from distant regions. Early Chinese trade networks facilitated the spread of bronze metallurgy, ceramic techniques, and agricultural innovations. Trade was therefore a vector for cultural evolution, shaping both the material and symbolic landscape of cities. Even within the city, trade created social mobility. Skilled artisans or successful merchants could accumulate wealth, gain access to elite circles, or sponsor public works. While elites controlled the highest levels of authority, commerce allowed talented individuals to improve their position, demonstrating that economic activity could intersect with social ambition. Marketplaces became microcosms of urban society, where skill, reputation, and negotiation shaped personal fortunes and influenced social dynamics. Trade networks also influenced urban identity. Cities became known for specific products, materials, or crafts. establishing reputations that extended beyond their walls. Uruk's pottery, Mohenjo-Daro's beads, and early Chinese bronze tools circulated widely, linking cities through recognition, demand, and shared standards. These economic reputations reinforced civic pride, encouraged specialization, and fostered competition and collaboration, all of which contributed to the development of early urban culture. Ultimately, trade was the lifeblood of early cities. It connected households, workshops, and neighborhoods, linked cities to regions, and integrated economic, social, and cultural life. It facilitated resource distribution, technological innovation, and cultural exchange while reinforcing social hierarchies and governance. Trade networks were not just about goods. They were about connectivity, organization, and the flow of ideas that enabled civilization to thrive. Walking through the bustling streets of Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, or early Chinese settlements, one could imagine merchants negotiating over pottery, artisans transporting goods from workshops, and laborers moving bulk materials for construction. Rivers, canals, and roads carried resources across distances, while marketplaces served as centers of interaction, observation, and influence. Trade was visible in every facet of daily life, from the food consumed to the luxury items displayed, shaping both the material and social landscape of early urban centers. Trade networks, therefore, were both practical and symbolic. They represented economic vitality, social cohesion, and cultural dynamism. They allowed cities to grow, populations to specialize, and societies to innovate. Without these networks, the first cities could not have sustained their populations, maintained public works, or participated in the broader exchange of ideas and culture that defined early civilization. Trade was the invisible thread that wove together neighborhoods, regions, and cultures, creating the tapestry of urban life. The rise of the first cities brought with it a need for specialized labor, creating the conditions for crafts and artisanal production to flourish. In Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements, craft production was not simply a matter of necessity. It was a cornerstone of urban identity, economic vitality, and cultural expression. The scale and organization of craft work reflected the growing complexity of urban life, where the creation of tools, pottery, textiles, jewelry, and other goods required both skill and coordination, integrating economic, social, and technological dimensions. In Uruk, craft districts were often spatially distinct, demonstrating early urban planning that recognized the need to concentrate artisans for efficiency and accessibility. Pottery workshops lined streets, with kilns placed strategically to avoid smoke and fire hazards. Clay was sourced from nearby riverbanks, shaped into containers, vessels, and ritual objects, then fired in kilns designed for maximum heat efficiency. Potters had to understand both material properties and thermal dynamics, balancing form, function, and aesthetic appeal. Their products were used domestically, for trade, and in religious ceremonies, highlighting the intersection of craft, commerce, and culture. Mohenjo-Daro similarly displays evidence of highly organized craft production. Archaeologists have uncovered workshops for bead-making, pottery, metalworking, and shell ornament production, often situated adjacent to residential quarters to allow for integration of domestic and economic life. Beads were drilled, polished, and strung with precision, while small-scale metallurgy produced tools and ornaments. Standardized weights and measures suggest that production was closely monitored, supporting trade within the city and with distant settlements. Craftspeople were not anonymous laborers. They were specialists whose expertise shaped both material culture and urban economy. Textile production was another vital craft, providing both clothing and household goods. Looms and spinning tools have been found in domestic spaces, indicating that weaving could be both household-based and semi-commercial. Artisans produced textiles from locally available fibers, sometimes incorporating dyes sourced from minerals or plants. This combination of natural resource management, technical skill, and aesthetic judgment demonstrates the sophistication of early urban crafts. In addition to practical use, textiles served as markers of status, with finer fabrics reserved for elites, ceremonial occasions, and trade. Metalworking was a critical craft with both practical and symbolic significance. In Uruk, early copper and bronze tools and ornaments were produced using techniques that required knowledge of smelting, alloying, and casting. Metal objects ranged from utilitarian implements to decorative items for elites, temples, and trade. Craft specialists developed mastery over heating, molding, and finishing processes, creating durable and aesthetically refined products. Similarly, in Mohenjo-Daro, bronze tools and ornaments demonstrate both technical proficiency and the capacity for standardized production, suggesting coordinated workshops that served multiple social and economic functions. The organization of craft production extended to spatial, social, and administrative systems. Workshops were often clustered together to facilitate sharing of raw materials, tools, and knowledge. Apprenticeship systems ensured the transmission of skill across generations, while elite patrons provided materials, commissions, and market access. In some cases, crafts were linked to religious practice, with artisans producing objects for temples, altars, or ceremonial purposes. The integration of craft into social, economic, and ritual life highlights its centrality to urban existence. Trade networks amplified the impact of specialized production. Artisans produced goods for both local consumption and exchange with other cities. Beads, pottery, metals, and textiles were transported across Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and the Yellow River Basin, carrying not only material value but also cultural influence. Urban economies depended on these networks, which connected workshops, markets, and consumers. Specialized production allowed cities to sustain large populations by providing both necessities and luxuries, while facilitating interregional connections that reinforced political and economic alliances. Craft production also reflected social stratification. Skilled artisans occupied a distinct middle tier between elite patrons and laborers who performed more generalized work. While artisans were not rulers, their expertise afforded them status, economic opportunity, and sometimes proximity to elite households. The quality, rarity, and aesthetic sophistication of their products were markers of both technical skill and social prestige, enabling artisans to participate in urban culture beyond mere survival. Laborers, in contrast, performed essential but less specialized tasks, supporting production indirectly through resource extraction, transport, and infrastructure maintenance. Technology and innovation were central to specialized production. Artisans experimented with materials, techniques, and forms, pushing the boundaries of what could be achieved. Potters refined kiln designs and clay compositions. Metalworkers mastered alloying and casting, and weavers developed complex patterns and dyeing methods. The iterative process of experimentation and adaptation led to improved efficiency, durability, and aesthetic quality. Cities became centers of technological creativity, where craft innovation contributed to both economic growth and cultural expression. The cultural dimension of craft production cannot be overstated. Objects created by artisans were embedded with meaning, reflecting religious beliefs, social norms, and aesthetic preferences. Pottery motifs, decorative beads, bronze ornaments, and textile patterns conveyed symbolic information, communicated status, and reinforced communal identity. Crafts were thus both functional and expressive, providing material evidence of the values, ideas, and worldview of urban populations. Workshops were also social spaces, fostering collaboration, apprenticeship, and knowledge transmission. Experienced artisans trained novices, often within family networks or guild-like associations. This transmission of expertise ensured continuity of skill across generations and maintained the quality and consistency of production. The social organization of craftwork highlights its importance not only as an economic activity, but as a conduit for cultural continuity and civic cohesion. Public and private patronage shaped craft production as well. Temples, elites, and civic authorities commissioned specialized goods for rituals, ceremonies, and administrative functions. In Uruk, temples received finely crafted vessels, tablets, and ornaments for religious use. In Mohenjo-Daro, elite households may have commissioned ornaments, tools, or decorative items. Patronage ensured that artisans had the resources, materials, and motivation to produce high-quality work, reinforcing social hierarchies while supporting urban prosperity. Craft production was also intimately tied to urban planning and infrastructure. Streets, storage facilities, Water access and workshop layouts were coordinated to maximize efficiency and safety. Kilns, for example, were located to minimize fire hazards, while metalworking areas were sited to allow ventilation and access to raw materials. Urban infrastructure supported specialized production, demonstrating that craft activity influenced and was influenced by the broader design and organization of the city. Environmental and material constraints shaped the development of crafts. Availability of clay, minerals, metals, and fibers dictated both production techniques and trade patterns. Cities adapted to local resources, while establishing trade networks to acquire materials not locally available. This interaction between environment, technology, and commerce exemplifies the complex systems that underpinned urban life. Crafts were not isolated practices. They were embedded in ecological, economic, and social networks that spanned neighborhoods, cities, and regions. Crafts and specialized production also had ritual and symbolic importance. Many objects served religious or ceremonial purposes, linking artisans' work to spiritual life. Pottery vessels, ritual beads, metal figurines, and decorated textiles often played roles in offerings, temple ceremonies, or communal events. Production was therefore a bridge between the material and spiritual, reflecting how urban life integrated work, ritual, and cultural expression into a cohesive whole. Ultimately, crafts and specialized production were essential to the first city's identity, economy, and culture. Artisans enabled urban life by providing tools, goods, and ornamentation, supporting trade and social differentiation, and transmitting cultural knowledge across generations. Their work reflected skill, creativity, and adaptability, demonstrating how humans transformed natural materials into objects that sustained, adorned, and defined civilization. Walking through the streets of Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, or early Chinese cities, one could see the traces of craft activity in every corner. Pottery drying in courtyards, metals being hammered into tools and ornaments, textiles woven and dyed in sunlight-filled rooms. Each object carried the imprint of specialized knowledge, labor, and cultural meaning, illustrating the inseparability of craft, urban life, and human ingenuity. Craft production was more than an economic necessity. It was the heartbeat of civilization, reflecting the skills, organization, and creativity that enabled cities to thrive. It connected individuals, neighborhoods, and cities to regional and interregional networks, facilitating exchange of goods, ideas, and culture. Through crafts, the first urban societies expressed identity, sustained populations, and projected influence across landscapes, leaving a material legacy that continues to reveal the ingenuity and resilience of early human civilization. The organization of early cities relied on religious and political institutions to coordinate society, manage resources, and maintain order. In Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements, temples, administrative buildings, and governing councils functioned as the backbone of urban life. These institutions were simultaneously centers of power, spiritual authority, and economic management, reflecting the inseparability of civic, religious, and political life in early cities. In Uruk, temples dominated the urban landscape both physically and symbolically. The Anu ziggurat was not only a religious focal point, but also a hub of economic activity. Priests and administrators managed offerings, controlled surplus goods, and organized labor for construction projects. These functions integrated religious authority with political and economic governance, allowing the temple to act as a central institution that coordinated city life. Festivals, rituals, and ceremonies reinforced the legitimacy of the priesthood while uniting citizens through shared cultural and spiritual practice. Mohenjo-Daro presents a slightly different model. While monumental religious architecture is less prominent than in Mesopotamia, administrative and ritual structures indicate that governance and spiritual practice were closely linked. Elevated citadels may have housed both elite residences and administrative offices, combining political and ceremonial authority. Standardized weights, seals, and record-keeping suggest that political institutions managed trade, craft production, and resource distribution. Religious practices were intertwined with civic administration, reinforcing social cohesion and legitimizing governance. Early Chinese cities also illustrate the integration of religious and political authority. Ceremonial platforms, altars, and palatial compounds functioned as centers for ritual observance and state governance. Rulers acted as intermediaries between the divine and the population, overseeing religious ceremonies while enforcing civic order. Institutions were codified in spatial design, with temples, administrative buildings, and ceremonial spaces arranged to reflect hierarchy, cosmology, and civic priorities. Governance, ritual, and public administration were thus inseparable in early urban life. Religious institutions often controlled critical resources, including grain, water, and craft materials. Priests supervised storage, distribution, and labor allocation, ensuring that both practical needs and spiritual obligations were met. Temples functioned as economic centers as much as religious ones, managing wealth, labor, and trade. Control over these resources reinforced social hierarchy, providing elites and religious authorities with influence over citizens' daily lives. Political institutions were closely tied to social stratification. Elites, administrators, and ruling councils directed labor, collected tribute, and oversaw urban planning. Artisans and laborers fulfilled roles dictated by these institutions, creating an organized division of labor that enabled cities to function efficiently. Religious authority and political oversight were mutually reinforcing, legitimizing leadership, and maintaining civic stability. The administration of justice was often conducted through religiously sanctioned institutions. Temples and palaces served as courts, resolving disputes, enforcing laws, and arbitrating contracts. Written records, inscriptions, and seals ensured accountability, transparency, and continuity. By embedding legal authority within religious and political institutions, early cities maintained social order while reinforcing the legitimacy of governance. Rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies were both spiritual and political instruments. In Uruk, processions through streets and plazas celebrated deities, while simultaneously demonstrating the power of the priesthood and the city-state. In Mohenjo-Daro, communal activities centered on public baths or gathering spaces reflected civic values and reinforced collective identity. Early Chinese cities used ceremonial platforms to connect rulership, ritual, and governance, reinforcing cosmological and civic authority. Religious and political institutions also facilitated urban planning and economic coordination. Temples and administrative buildings served as focal points for street layouts, markets, and workshops. Control over labor, craft production, and trade networks allowed institutions to ensure efficient resource distribution and the organization of public works. These institutions were therefore both practical and symbolic, shaping the material and social infrastructure of cities. Education, literacy, and record-keeping were often concentrated within institutional centers. Priests, scribes, and administrators managed cuneiform tablets, seals, and other records, ensuring continuity of governance and ritual practice. Literacy was a tool of authority, reinforcing hierarchy and centralizing power. Crafts, trade, and labor were coordinated through institutional oversight, demonstrating the intertwined nature of religion, politics, and economy in early cities. Ultimately, religious and political institutions shaped urban identity, governance, and cultural expression. Temples, administrative buildings, and ceremonial platforms were both functional centers and symbols of civic cohesion. They coordinated labor, controlled resources, mediated disputes, and integrated spiritual and political authority. By examining these institutions, we see how early cities managed complexity, maintained order, and expressed the values and ambitions of their inhabitants. In walking through these cities, one can imagine the constant presence of institutional authority. Temples guided ritual practice, administrative offices oversaw production and trade, and ruling councils enforced law and order. Citizens engaged with these institutions daily, whether by participating in festivals, paying tribute, crafting goods, or obeying regulations. Institutions were the invisible scaffolding that held urban life together, ensuring both functionality and identity. The first cities were not merely agglomerations of people and buildings. They were centers of governance, ritual, and social coordination. In early urban settlements such as Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and cities along the Yellow River, Religious and political institutions functioned as the backbone of civic life. These institutions were responsible for administering resources, maintaining social order, and providing the symbolic framework through which citizens understood their place in the urban hierarchy. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined, with spiritual authority reinforcing political legitimacy and political power ensuring the continuity of religious practices. In Uruk, temples dominated the city's skyline and the daily rhythms of its inhabitants. The Anu Ziggurat, one of the earliest monumental religious structures, was not merely a place of worship, but also a hub of economic and administrative activity. Priests controlled the distribution of offerings, managed storehouses, and organized labor for public works. The temple functioned as a center where spiritual, economic, and administrative activities converged. Festivals, rituals, and ceremonies were orchestrated by religious authorities, yet they served political and social purposes as well, reinforcing the legitimacy of the ruling elite and fostering civic cohesion. Similarly, in Mohenjo-Daro, although monumental temples are less conspicuous than in Mesopotamia, administrative and ceremonial structures suggest that religious and political functions were closely linked. Elevated citadels may have housed both elite officials and ritual leaders, reflecting an integration of governance and spiritual oversight. Standardized weights, seals, and inscriptions indicate that administration was rigorous, with political institutions managing trade, labor, and resource allocation. Religious observances were likely interwoven with civic responsibilities, ensuring that the spiritual and material well-being of the city were mutually reinforced. Early Chinese cities provide another model of intertwined religious and political authority. Palatial complexes, ceremonial platforms, and altars served as sites for both governance and ritual. Kings and rulers acted as intermediaries between the divine and their subjects, performing religious ceremonies that legitimized their authority while managing administrative tasks. Urban design reflected cosmological principles, with temples and administrative buildings arranged to mirror celestial order and reinforce social hierarchy. The spatial organization of cities thus codified the unity of ritual, politics, and urban planning. Religious institutions often controlled key resources, further solidifying their social and political influence. Temples managed grain stores, oversaw water distribution, and allocated labor for construction projects. This concentration of resources allowed priests and spiritual leaders to exercise power beyond the purely ceremonial realm. In Uruk, the management of surplus grain and crafted goods provided priests with leverage over the city's economy, allowing them to influence markets, trade, and labor allocation. Similarly, in Mohenjo-Daro, elevated administrative areas within the citadel likely coordinated both ritual and material production, ensuring that the city's economic and religious life were deeply interconnected. Political institutions functioned to regulate urban life, enforce laws, and organize labor. In Mesopotamian cities, rulers and administrative councils oversaw the construction of walls, canals, and public buildings, coordinated trade, and adjudicated disputes. Written records, such as cuneiform tablets, preserved contracts, tax obligations, and property ownership, allowing officials to maintain continuity and accountability. These administrative frameworks were often embedded within religious institutions, as priests served as scribes, accountants, and intermediaries between the rulers and the populace. Political authority was thus inseparable from religious oversight. Social stratification was reinforced through institutional authority. Elites and priests controlled both governance and ritual, while artisans and laborers operated within the frameworks established by these institutions. Access to sacred spaces, participation in festivals, and involvement in civic decision-making were often determined by social rank. Religious ceremonies legitimized the power of elites, while political administration ensured compliance with social norms and resource distribution. In this way, urban institutions were both practical and symbolic, coordinating labor and asserting hierarchical order. Education and literacy were concentrated within institutional centers. Priests, scribes, and administrators managed records, facilitated trade, and coordinated labor. Literacy and numeracy were privileges associated with religious and political authority, giving elite classes control over information and governance. In Uruk, cuneiform tablets recorded offerings, trade, and administrative decisions. Similarly, seals and inscriptions in Mohenjo-Daro indicate a system of standardized accounting, suggesting that record-keeping was central to both economic management and governance. By controlling knowledge, institutions reinforced social hierarchy and centralized authority. Institutions also played a critical role in dispute resolution and legal administration. Temples and palaces functioned as courts, arbitrating conflicts over property, trade, and labor. Religious sanction lent legitimacy to legal decisions, ensuring compliance and reinforcing the authority of ruling elites. Legal frameworks were intertwined with ritual obligations, illustrating that governance in early cities relied on both formal regulation and moral or spiritual authority. Rituals, festivals, and public ceremonies served political, social, and spiritual functions simultaneously. In Uruk, processions and offerings were public spectacles that displayed the power of the priesthood and ruling elites, while uniting citizens in shared cultural experience. Mohenjo-Daro's communal spaces, such as the Great Bath, may have hosted collective rituals that reinforced social cohesion and civic identity. Early Chinese ceremonial platforms performed similar functions, connecting cosmology, rulership, and urban governance. These public displays helped legitimize authority, foster community participation, and integrate religion into daily life. Trade, craft production, and urban planning were all coordinated by institutional oversight. Temples and administrative centers directed labor for construction, monitored markets, and managed resource allocation. By centralizing control over both economic and spiritual activity, institutions ensured that cities could function efficiently, sustain populations, and support large-scale projects. Urban life depended on the seamless integration of these administrative, religious, and economic functions. The architectural prominence of institutions reinforced their authority. Temples, palaces, and administrative buildings were often the largest and most visually striking structures in the city, symbolizing power and control. Elevated platforms, monumental staircases, and ornate decorations served as markers of status and legitimacy. The physical dominance of these structures reflected the hierarchical organization of urban society, signaling to residents and visitors alike the centrality of institutional authority in city life. Religious and political institutions were also critical for the continuity of culture and memory. They preserved ritual knowledge, codified laws, and recorded historical events. This archival function allowed cities to maintain stability over generations, even as populations grew and social dynamics evolved. Institutions acted as repositories of collective knowledge, linking past practices to present governance and shaping the trajectory of urban civilization. Ultimately, the integration of religious and political institutions in early cities illustrates the inseparability of governance, ritual, and urban life. Temples and administrative buildings coordinated labor, controlled resources, enforced laws, and maintained social cohesion. They provided a framework through which citizens understood their roles, responsibilities, and place in the social hierarchy. Authority was expressed not only through governance but also through ritual, architecture, and symbolic power, embedding social order into the physical and cultural landscape of the city. Walking through the streets of Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, or early Chinese settlements, one would constantly encounter the influence of these institutions. Temples and administrative centers shaped movement, dictated labor obligations, and coordinated trade. Festivals and public rituals punctuated daily life, reinforcing hierarchy and fostering communal identity. Institutional authority was omnipresent, guiding the rhythms of the city and ensuring that complex societies could function cohesively and endure over time. The enduring legacy of religious and political institutions is evident in the archaeological record. Monumental architecture, inscriptions, administrative tablets, and ritual objects all testify to the organizational sophistication and cultural centrality of these institutions. By examining how governance and spiritual authority were intertwined, we gain insight into the mechanisms that enabled cities to sustain large populations, manage resources, and create enduring urban civilizations. The first cities were not isolated phenomena. They were nodes in extensive networks of cultural exchange that linked regions, communities, and civilizations. In Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements, the circulation of ideas, technologies, artistic motifs, and religious practices was as vital as the movement of goods. Cultural exchange shaped urban development, informed craft production, influenced religious rituals, and fostered the spread of innovations across vast distances. Understanding these processes illuminates how early cities became catalysts for human creativity and cross-cultural interaction. Trade networks were among the primary conduits of cultural diffusion. Merchants and artisans carried not only commodities but also knowledge, skills, and ideas between cities and regions. In Mesopotamia, Uruk maintained connections with nearby city-states and more distant settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates. These exchanges introduced new pottery designs, metallurgical techniques, and symbolic motifs, which were adapted and incorporated into local traditions. Similarly, Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus Valley cities traded extensively with Central Asia, the Iranian Plateau, and the Arabian Sea region, transmitting innovations in beadmaking, seal carving, and standardized measurements. Early Chinese cities were also connected through riverine and overland networks that facilitated the dissemination of bronze casting methods, ceramic styles, and ritual practices. The movement of ideas was reciprocal. Cities absorbed innovations from neighboring regions and contributed their own unique developments to wider cultural networks. Writing systems exemplify this phenomenon. The development of cuneiform in Mesopotamia inspired administrative practices and record-keeping methods that spread across surrounding areas. The Indus script, though still undeciphered, demonstrates the exchange of symbolic communication techniques, while early Chinese oracle bones reveal a parallel development of writing for ritual and governance. These systems were essential for managing complex urban societies and facilitated the transfer of knowledge across generations and regions. Religious practices were another major domain of cultural diffusion. Rituals, temple designs, and ceremonial objects traveled along trade routes and through diplomatic contacts. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats and temple layouts influenced the construction of sacred spaces in neighboring regions. Mohenjo-Daro's communal baths and ritual objects suggest standardized ceremonial practices that reflected broader cultural norms. Early Chinese cities incorporated ritual platforms and ancestral shrines that drew on both local traditions and imported ceremonial motifs. Religious exchange reinforced shared cosmologies, legitimized rulers, and fostered social cohesion across communities. Artistic expression was deeply affected by cultural interaction. Pottery, sculpture, jewelry, and decorative motifs reveal the transmission of styles and techniques across urban centers. Mesopotamian cylinder seals, with intricate iconography, influenced artistic production in distant settlements, while Indus Valley motifs were imitated and adapted in regional contexts. Early Chinese bronze vessels exhibit both local innovation and the influence of cross-regional design elements. The diffusion of artistic ideas created a shared visual language that linked disparate cities and reinforced their identities within broader cultural networks. Technological innovation also spread through cultural exchange. Metalworking techniques, construction methods, and agricultural practices moved along trade and communication routes. Uruk's innovations in kiln design and brick production influenced neighboring Mesopotamian cities. Indus Valley metallurgy, including sophisticated alloying techniques, was disseminated through trade and interaction with neighboring regions. Early Chinese cities benefited from the exchange of irrigation practices, bronze casting methods, and ceramic technologies. The sharing of knowledge allowed cities to adapt, innovate, and solve local challenges, demonstrating that cultural diffusion was both practical and transformative. Language, literacy, and administrative practices traveled alongside material culture. Scribal training, accounting methods, and bureaucratic protocols were shared across urban networks, allowing cities to manage complex trade, labor, and governance systems. The adoption of standardized weights and measures in the Indus Valley, for example, reflects a broader influence of administrative rationalization. Similarly, Mesopotamian accounting practices influenced neighboring regions, supporting the expansion of trade and the regulation of urban economies. These administrative exchanges highlight how ideas and knowledge were central to the functioning of early cities. Cultural exchange extended to music, performance, and oral traditions. Instruments, songs, and storytelling practices circulated between communities, shaping entertainment, ritual, and education. Festivals provided occasions for showcasing new musical forms, theatrical performances, and dance, enabling innovations to spread across urban networks. In this way, intangible cultural elements traveled alongside tangible goods, creating shared cultural experiences and reinforcing connections between cities. Urban elites played a key role in facilitating cultural diffusion. They sponsored artisans, commissioned temples, and organized trade missions, ensuring that innovations and artistic styles were introduced and integrated into local culture. Patronage also allowed elites to display their cosmopolitanism, acquire prestige, and consolidate power. By encouraging the movement of ideas, materials, and technologies, elite classes contributed to the dynamism and interconnectedness of early cities, shaping both the local environment and regional networks. Cultural diffusion was also shaped by migration and mobility. Artisans, traders, priests, and laborers moved between cities, bringing skills, practices, and ideas with them. These individuals acted as agents of change, transmitting innovations and adapting them to new contexts. Migration facilitated hybridization, where local traditions merged with external influences to create novel artistic forms, religious practices, and technological solutions. Cities became crucibles of creativity, where cultural exchange drove innovation and social evolution. The integration of cultural exchange into urban planning is evident in city layouts and architecture. Markets, workshops, temples, and public spaces were organized to support interaction, commerce, and ceremonial activity. Streets facilitated the flow of goods and ideas, while plazas and gathering spaces enabled public performances, rituals, and civic participation. Urban design both reflected and reinforced the movement of cultural elements, creating environments that nurtured creativity, communication, and social cohesion. Education and knowledge transmission were central to sustaining cultural diffusion. Temples, schools, and administrative centers preserved written and oral knowledge, enabling ideas to spread and endure. Apprenticeships in crafts, training of scribes, and participation in religious rituals ensured that skills and cultural practices were passed down. Literacy, numeracy, and specialized expertise were critical to managing trade, governance, and ritual life, and the dissemination of this knowledge facilitated cultural continuity and innovation across urban networks. Conflict and diplomacy also played roles in cultural exchange. Cities that engaged in alliances, tribute systems, or military campaigns often adopted foreign technologies, administrative systems, and artistic styles. Interaction through negotiation, conquest, or alliance enabled cross-fertilization of ideas, enriching urban culture while also reinforcing political and social hierarchies. Exchange was therefore not only voluntary, but sometimes a byproduct of strategic relationships between cities. The legacy of early cultural diffusion is evident in the archaeological and textual record. Artifacts, inscriptions, architectural remains, and ritual objects all bear testimony to the movement of ideas across regions. Cylinder seals, beads, pottery, bronze vessels, and urban layouts illustrate how local practices were influenced by external sources. Writing systems, religious symbols, and administrative protocols demonstrate the spread of abstract concepts that shaped governance, social organization, and collective identity. Ultimately, cultural exchange and the diffusion of ideas were fundamental to the growth, resilience, and creativity of early cities. They connected Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese settlements to regional and interregional networks, enabling the circulation of knowledge, technology, and artistic expression. Through commerce, migration, patronage, and ritual, these urban centers became engines of innovation, shaping human civilization in ways that extended far beyond their geographic boundaries. Walking through the streets of these early cities, one could imagine artisans copying foreign motifs, traders discussing new techniques, and priests adapting rituals encountered in distant regions. Ideas flowed alongside goods, technologies spread across rivers and plains, and innovations transformed everyday life. Cultural exchange was a living process, inseparable from trade, governance, craft, and ritual. demonstrating that cities were not just physical spaces but dynamic nodes of human creativity, communication, and transformation. The interconnectivity fostered by cultural diffusion ensured that cities were more than isolated experiments. They were collaborative projects in human ingenuity, allowing civilizations to learn, adapt, and evolve together. By studying these processes, we gain insight into the mechanisms through which knowledge, culture, and technology were shared, setting the stage for future waves of innovation that would define the trajectory of human history. As the first cities expanded, with populations swelling into the thousands and urban life becoming increasingly complex, humans faced challenges that exceeded the capacities of memory, oral communication, and informal record-keeping. Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese cities were hubs of trade, craft production, resource management, and ritual practice. Coordinating such multifaceted urban systems required an unprecedented level of organization, precision, and communication. Out of this necessity emerged one of humanity's most transformative innovations: writing. Writing was not merely a tool for communication, it was a technology of governance, economy, and culture, fundamentally reshaping the way humans lived, thought, and interacted in urban environments. In Uruk, writing first appeared as a series of pictographic symbols pressed into clay tablets. Initially, these marks were utilitarian, representing commodities such as grain, livestock, or labor allocations. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of clay tablets that recorded distributions, debts, and transactions. These tablets were managed by temple administrators, who were both literate and responsible for overseeing resources and labor. The invention of writing in this context was a direct response to urban complexity. When hundreds of people produced, traded, or stored goods, memory alone could not ensure accuracy, fairness, or accountability. Writing allowed information to be preserved reliably, verified, and transmitted across time and space. The emergence of writing in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus Valley cities reveals a parallel phenomenon, though with distinctive local features. Indus seals, often engraved with pictograms and symbols, appear to have served administrative and commercial functions, marking property, trade goods, or official authorization. These symbols suggest a standardized system of communication that facilitated coordination across large urban centers and interconnected trade networks. While the Indus script remains undeciphered, its widespread presence in cities, citadels, and workshops indicates that writing was crucial for managing the complexities of urban life, from economic transactions to craft production. Early Chinese cities, too, integrated writing into urban management and ritual practice. Oracle bones, inscribed with questions posed to ancestors or deities, served both religious and administrative purposes. The inscriptions recorded divinations, resource allocations, and ceremonial obligations, reflecting a system in which spiritual, political, and practical needs converged. Writing allowed rulers and administrators to maintain order, codify ritual protocol, and assert authority, demonstrating that the power of the written word extended far beyond practical record-keeping. Across regions, writing transformed human labor from loosely coordinated efforts into tightly organized urban systems, making large-scale projects, from irrigation canals to monumental architecture, feasible. Economic management was another key driver for writing. Cities required accurate accounting for trade, taxation, and storage of surplus. Clay tablets in Mesopotamia recorded quantities of grain, livestock, and crafted goods, creating a permanent record of economic activity. Standardized weights and measures, often documented through inscriptions or seal impressions, allowed merchants and administrators to conduct transactions with consistency and trust. In the Indus Valley, standardized seals suggest a similar system of economic regulation, ensuring that goods moved efficiently across local and regional networks. Writing enabled complex economies to function reliably, transforming trade and production into repeatable, auditable systems. Legal administration also depended on the written word. Laws, contracts, and agreements were codified on tablets or inscriptions, providing an authoritative reference for resolving disputes. In Uruk, legal texts outlined property rights, obligations, and penalties, embedding social norms into a durable medium. Similarly, in early Chinese cities, inscriptions and divinations documented agreements, reinforcing social order and establishing precedent. Writing provided continuity across generations, ensuring that rules and obligations persisted even as populations changed, rulers shifted, and urban life evolved. Religious and ritual life was profoundly influenced by writing. Temples and administrative centers relied on written records to manage offerings, ceremonial schedules, and priestly duties. In Uruk, priests recorded offerings of grain, livestock, and crafted goods, ensuring that rituals were performed correctly and that resources were allocated appropriately. Oracle bones in early China documented questions posed to ancestors, guiding decisions on governance, agriculture, and military action. Writing provided a medium through which humans could communicate with both earthly authorities and the divine, codifying belief systems and ritual practices. Beyond administration, writing facilitated cultural continuity and intellectual development. Texts preserved myths, stories, and historical events, linking generations and creating shared memory. In Mesopotamia, early literary compositions such as hymns and myths were inscribed alongside economic records, suggesting that writing served both practical and symbolic functions. In Mohenjo-Daro and early Chinese cities, inscriptions carried cultural meaning, encoding knowledge about society, religion, and governance. Writing allowed ideas to transcend the constraints of time and geography, connecting citizens to a broader cultural and historical narrative. Writing also enabled cities to manage internal complexity and external relations simultaneously. Diplomatic correspondence, trade agreements, and treaties could be documented and transported across regions. In Mesopotamia, city-states sent letters on clay tablets to negotiate trade, alliances, or disputes, establishing a network of intercity communication. In the Indus Valley and early China, inscriptions and seals may have performed similar functions, enabling rulers and administrators to extend influence beyond immediate urban boundaries. Writing was therefore both a tool for internal organization and a medium for interregional engagement. The emergence of writing transformed human cognition and social organization. Recording information in durable form allowed people to conceptualize abstract categories, plan over extended periods, and coordinate complex tasks. Writing created a shared reference point, reducing errors, fostering trust, and enabling collective action at a scale previously impossible. Urban societies could sustain large populations, manage intricate economic networks, and engage in monumental projects because writing provided a mechanism for storing, transmitting, and verifying information reliably. Education and literacy were closely tied to institutional authority. Priests, scribes, and administrators controlled access to written knowledge, ensuring that literacy remained a specialized skill associated with governance, ritual, and elite status. Apprenticeship systems transmitted writing skills, enabling continuity and innovation. Literacy reinforced hierarchy, as those who could read and write wielded power over resources, labor, and information. Writing was both a technical tool and a social instrument, structuring authority within early urban centers. The integration of writing into urban life underscores its centrality to civilization itself, from economic management to religious practice, from labor coordination to diplomacy. Writing enabled cities to function as organized, resilient, and enduring systems. Without the invention of writing, the complexity of Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, and early Chinese cities would have been unsustainable. Written communication provided the scaffolding upon which urban society could expand, innovate, and preserve its achievements across time. As we reflect on the emergence of writing, it becomes clear that this innovation was not merely a response to practical challenges. It was a transformative cultural and intellectual development. Writing shaped the way humans thought about resources, social obligations, authority, and history. It allowed early urban societies to plan for the future, codify norms, and transmit knowledge with unprecedented precision. Writing was both a product of urban complexity and a driver of further sophistication, enabling cities to grow, thrive, and leave a lasting legacy. The invention of writing marks a turning point in human history, one that bridges the practical demands of city life with the symbolic and cultural ambitions of civilization. It flows naturally into the next phase of our exploration, the development of writing systems themselves, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, oracle bones, and Proto-Indus scripts. These systems exemplify how humans converted necessity into innovation, transforming abstract ideas into tangible symbols that could govern cities, guide ritual, and communicate across generations. The story of writing is the story of civilization, demonstrating that human ingenuity rises in response to complexity, challenge, and aspiration.